Hi, welcome to Hillcrest Sermons, growing together.
Show us your heart's delight.
Right. Good morning. Don't mind me. I'm just carrying some things. Well, it is an honor to be able to serve this community in the role of lead pastor, and so just thank you to all who are part of that process and praying and discerning, and we have really good things ahead as a community, and so grateful to be doing it with you all. And to be honest, it feels a little weird because I just feel like I'm just a guy who loves to teach and loves to be part of this community, and but really grateful to be on mission with you all here at Hillcrest. And we get to keep studying Leviticus. How fortunate are we? So I do want to invite you. We're going to dive in. Chow, thank you for reading this morning. And I know that's a bit of a dense text that we just heard, but I think we're going to walk through it together and see what God might have to say to us. So if you've got your Bibles, I'll invite you to open up in Leviticus. Leviticus is way to the left in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's right after Exodus, right before Numbers. We're going to be in Leviticus chapter 25 this morning, which is one of the most fascinating and amazing chapters of the Hebrew Scriptures. I mean, it's so interesting. And I just hope, I find it fascinating. Hopefully, we can see what God might have to say to us this morning through it. So I'm going to just pick up in Leviticus 25, beginning of verse 1, and we're just going to dive in to the teaching this morning. So the Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord." All right, let's pause. I think these first couple of verses, they actually help just kind of remind us what's going on, where we are, what's Leviticus about here. And so just a couple things to notice. First of all, the people being addressed are the Israelites. So reminder, the book of Leviticus is a priestly manual to an ancient Near Eastern tribal people called the Israelites. It's just good to remember, this is from millennia ago that we're reading. And this tribal people, the Israelites, they had been enslaved in Egypt. And they cried out to God out of their oppression, and we're told that God heard their cry and acted to rescue them. And so right away we remember that the God of Leviticus is the God who hears the cry of the oppressed. I think we have a slide there we go. The God of Leviticus is the God who hears the cry of the oppressed, the Israelites. And then we're told that the Lord said this at Mount Sinai. And so Mount Sinai, after God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt, he took them out of Egypt and he took them into the wilderness of Sinai. They wandered in the wilderness and he took them to Mount Sinai. And earlier we're told that at Mount Sinai, God formed this promised covenant relationship with his people there. And so another thing that when we move into the book of Leviticus, the God of Leviticus is the God who desires to form covenant relationships with people. This is the kind of God that we're encountering in Leviticus. So the Israelites, Mount Sinai, and then we're told that God speaks. God speaks to Moses, and then through Moses to the people. And that kind of throughout Exodus, throughout Leviticus, we're seeing that God says things to Moses. God passes this on to the people, all kinds of instructions on how to walk with God. And so this theme that shows up over and over again is the God who rescues people from slavery, who forms a covenant relationship with them, desires to shape this people into a people who look like God, who reflect God's character and values. He's forming them. He's ethically and spiritually and socially forming them into a people that look like him. And then we're told that they do this out Mount Sinai, and then there's this reference to the land I will give you. And so, again, the God who rescued them out of slavery forms a covenant relationship and is forming them. Even at this point, they've gone from landless slaves to now wandering tribal people, but God says, one day I'm going to give you a homeland. I'm going to settle you in a homeland. That the God of Leviticus is a God who desires to set people in homes. This is the God that we encounter in Leviticus. And then we're told that once this formerly enslaved people who are in covenant relationship with God, who are being formed into his character, who have been set in homes, once they're there in this land, we're told that the land itself must get Sabbath rest, which is so interesting. Last week, Hannah talked about Sabbath, this like 6+1 rhythm that God builds into creation. And a lot of it is focused on kind of the weekly rhythm. 1 day out of every 7 that people should rest, and the workers should rest, and the animals should rest, the rich should rest, the poor should rest. This is a rhythm that God desires for his people to have, to stop work, to cease working, to rest, and to enjoy the life God has given people. But Sabbath, right here in Leviticus, it goes beyond just people and animals resting. It goes beyond just a weekly rest. Here it starts talking about a 1 year out of every 7 rest, and not just people and animals, but even land gets to rest, which is like so, there's so much to be done with the theology of land in Scripture. It's interesting, like the land itself is meant to have a rest. If we continue on, so we've read verses 1, 2, pick up in verse 3, we see this here. It says, "For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather your crops." So, 6 years do your normal farming, because most of the people at this time are farmers. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a year of Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Every 7 years, the land gets to rest. And it's so, and in fact, God takes this so seriously. In the book of Chronicles, we're told that the people of Israel go into exile because the land didn't get its Sabbath rest. And I just, imagine being a farming family in the ancient Near East. There's no social welfare or food bank. It's just you scratching out a living, hand to mouth. And God says, I want to take care of you. I want you to farm this land. But every 7th year, I want you to take a break from farming. Take a break from plowing. Take a break from planting. Take a break from harvesting, and just rest. I want you to live off the stores from the previous 6 years. And in fact, the land, we're told, your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves, it's forever. During the 7th year, anybody can eat of it. So the poor in the land, they should just come through and take what they want. The immigrants in the land, they can just come through and take what they want. And yeah, like any given day, you can pick some grapes to eat, but there's no systematic harvesting during this 7th year. Imagine the kind of trust that would take. Imagine the kind of I trust you're going to provide for us, God. You're going to provide for my family. Imagine the kind of generosity of the Spirit it would take. I'm going to just trust, God, you've got it. As all these people walk through my field and walk through my vineyard and they eat, I'm going to just trust. I'm going to be generous. Imagine how freeing and joyful this year would be if you gave yourself over to it and said, this year is just to enjoy the life God has given me. This is the Sabbath year. Now, maybe you're sitting there and you're thinking, Tim, that is the most naive and unrealistic thing I have ever heard. Sustenance for every 7 years, not farming. How does that even work? And if that is your reaction to this, this is so unrealistic, Leviticus says to you, hold my mug of ancient Near Eastern wine. You haven't seen anything yet. I want to jump down to verse 8 because Leviticus takes it even further. All right. Leviticus says, jumping down to verse 8. So every 7 years they do this year of rest. Then it says in verse 8, count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbath years amount to a period of 49 years. Okay, so it's the Sabbaths of sevens, that's the number, right? So every 7 chunks of 7, every 49 years, that's the super Sabbath. That's the Voltron of Sabbaths. This is the ultimate Sabbath. And it says in this year, verse 9, then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. We talked about Day of Atonement a couple weeks ago. On the Day of Atonement, sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year. So at the end of the 49th year, beginning of the 50th year, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. So every seventh year they do this, and then the 7 times 7, so the end of the 49th year, it's like this is a super Sabbath. And they says after the Day of Atonement. Now remember Day of Atonement. That was the goats. Remember Goat Week? And that was about like God provides different ways for people to be forgiven and right with Him. But on the Day of Atonement, that's once a year where the goats provide like the total cleansing of sin all the way to the Holy Holy. And then the sin is placed on the head of the scapegoat and taken to the wilderness. So like all the sin and wrongdoing and like the moral gunk of the people, it is gone and forgiven. And the people on the Day of Atonement, they know they are totally right with God. They are right with God. So on the Day of Atonement, at the Super Sabbath, sound the trumpet. And now sound the trumpet. The trumpet isn't like a brass trumpet. The trumpet is a shofar. Can everybody say shofar? A ram's horn. And it's less a musical instrument, and it's more like a alert system, a siren sound. And I thought it'd be fun. Like it's one thing to just talk about the shofar. It'd be more fun to hear the shofar, don't you think? Yes, of course. It's always more fun. So we've got our ram's horn shofar here, and it's literally just a ram's horn, a hollow ram's horn, and it's an interesting sound. It's more of a buzzing kind of siren sound than an instrumental musical sound. And so every the end of the 49th year, Day of Atonement, and then you're meant to sound the shofar. Throughout the land, village after village. And maybe you think, that's not the most musical noise I've ever heard. No, it's not, but it's the sound that they use. It alerts the people, like the moment has come. And so they sound the shofar, and then they declare liberty. They proclaim liberty throughout the land. And the Hebrew word for liberty there is doror. I think we have this next slide. Doror, freedom or liberty or release from captivity. And doror, and this, I just want you to hold on to this. Doror is not a common word in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's actually quite an unusual word. It occurs here, it occurs a couple times in the prophets. It's not just like a generic word for release or freedom. It's a very specific word for Jubilee freedom. This 50th year technical Jubilee freedom. That is what doror is about. That we're going to come back to that later, and so hold on to doror. So, Sabbath to Sabbath, every 50 years, Day of Atonement, everything is right with God, sound the shofar, proclaim doror, freedom throughout the land. Now, what does that freedom entail? What does that liberty or that release look like? Let's look at the next verses to see what this freedom entails. So, picking up in verse 11, we read, the 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the unintended vine. So very similar to the Sabbath year. For it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from your fields. Here's the next, verse 13 is kind of the punchline. In this year of jubilee, everyone is to return to their own property. Everybody goes home. Maybe you think, well, what does that mean? What does it mean exactly that everybody goes home? What it means is this, that when God, when the people of Israel move into the homeland, God gives them land. God gives the whole people land, but then He gives the tribes specific pieces of land. And then the clans within the tribes, specific pieces of land. And then the families within the clans, within the tribes, specific pieces of land. So your ancestral family had your ancestral farmland. This was your family's land. And He says every 50 years, no matter what has happened, your family gets to go back to that land. Not to visit, not like knock, knock, hey, I grew up here, can I look around? Your family gets to go back and live and work and farm this land again. And so what this means is imagine you're an ancient Near Eastern farming family. And you're scratching out a living, and grandma and grandpa are trying to do it right. They're trying to trust God. They're practicing the Sabbath years, but they hit some hard times. There's a couple of drought years. And they get to a point where grandma and grandpa have to sell the family farm. They become tenant farmers on their own land, but they don't own it anymore. They're just kind of day laborers now. And that's how mom and dad grew up, and that's how you grew up. And they've tried to save, and they've tried to save up enough to buy the land back or buy a different piece of land, but they can't do it. They're just kind of stuck, just trying to get by. And this poverty is being passed down from one generation to the next. And God says, I want Jubilee to come, and they get the farm back. They get to go home, and your family gets to start over. See, Jubilee was about going home. Jubilee was about a fresh start. Jubilee was about breaking cycles of generational poverty. Jubilee was about the rich don't always get richer, and the poor don't always get poorer. That each generation is going to have a chance to make it themselves. Jubilee was about a return home. Jubilee. And God says, every 50 years, every generation, I want Jubilee to happen. Now, it's really interesting how this works. Because Jubilee, it wasn't as simple as Fight Club, burn down the first bank of Bethlehem. It's not like that kind of thing. Jubilee, it was about a very specific kind of economic system that God was setting up. Read verse 14 here. It says, I think I'm jumping down to verse 15. Yeah, verse 15. You are to buy from your own people on the basis of the number of years since Jubilee, and they are to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. And basically what this is saying is, you don't actually sell the land, you rent the land based on the number of harvests until the next Jubilee. So there's 15 harvests till next Jubilee. That's what you sell it for, but knowing that you get it back. So it's not a permanent sale of land. If you jump down to verse 33, God's very clear about this. He says, "The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers." And so God says, you can't permanently sell it. I want each family to have that land from generation to generation. You're allowed to rent it out, but you can't permanently sell. This is so interesting to me. If you are a young person, you're interested in economics, we need Christians to think with the scriptures deeply about economics. Because what God is doing here, he's setting up a market economy, but not an unlimited market economy, a rental market economy of land. So each generation has access to means of production, and the whole thing is limited by a very specific ethical vision. It's interesting stuff. This is what God is doing. He's creating a community, a society that is meant to look like him. People are taken care of. Interesting. And throughout this chapter, over and over again, God is providing ways for when people fall behind economically for them to get lifted up. Every 50 years, he says they get to return to their homeland. There's also this whole thing about the right of redemption you can read about, which basically means, even if you sell the land, you're not to Jubilee yet. If, Cousin Phil can help you buy the land back, you're always allowed to do that. So the right of redemption is guaranteed. And so God's trying to make sure people don't fall far behind. But at the same time, even in this same chapter, God recognizes that sometimes this happens. And so if one part of Jubilee is about returning home, I want to go kind of the next part of Jubilee. Because as you go farther through the chapter, God recognizes, well, if this happens to a family, this is how I want you to take care of them. If this happens to a family, this is how I want you to take care of them. And then it gets all the way down to God recognizes what might happen is a family might fall so far behind, they basically have to sell themselves into debt slavery. Read verse 39 here. It says, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, Do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. And so if part of Jubilee is about returning home, this other part is about this idea of release. Because imagine that you're that ancient Near Eastern farming family. And imagine that grandma and grandpa, they're doing their best, but they had to sell the family farm. And that grandma and grandpa, they were tenant farmers on their own land. But then mom and dad, things got even worse, and they made some bad decisions, and they tried to do some investments that didn't work out. And so mom and dad, they actually had to sell the family into this kind of indentured servitude. This is the only way they could keep putting food on the table. They had to do something to survive. And now this is where you're growing up. You're growing up in this kind of indentured servitude. You're working for a very wealthy family, doing what they want. The idea of saving up to get out of this, it's almost unthinkable. And God says every 50 years, there is a release. Freedom is announced. And everyone is set free, and you get to go back to your ancestral land and start over. Jubilee is about freedom. Jubilee is about escaping the slavery of debt. Jubilee is about each generation getting a chance to make it. Jubilee is about all the things that can entrap people, letting them free from those things. Jubilee is about being set free. Jubilee. So every 50 years they would, after they would do these every 7 years they're doing this rest, but on the seventh Sabbath year, they'd observe the Day of Atonement. They'd be assured that everything is right between them and God. The shofar would be sounded throughout the land, and doror, liberty, the right to return home and to be set free, would be proclaimed throughout the land. Jubilee. It's a beautiful vision. If you're like, oh, this is so interesting, if you want to study it more, I like to provide, ways for people to dig into stuff. A couple weeks ago, I recommended this Christopher Wright Old Testament ethics book, and I gave you a selection from that if you wanted. He had a chunk on the year of Jubilee that I thought some people might be interested in, so I made photocopies. There's going to be a stack up front. There's also a stack by the main exit there if you want to grab that. If you want to do further study with your housemates, your small group, on your own self, that is available to you. This Jubilee vision giving to us in Leviticus. But here's something interesting. So it's this beautiful, powerful vision, Jubilee, Day of Atonement, right with God, shofar throughout the land, proclaim doror, proclaim liberty. But scholars, people have all these debates. Nobody knows if Israel ever even did it. There's debate. Some people think maybe they did it for a while and then they gave it up. Some people, I don't know, because there's very few references throughout the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures to anything like this. And there's this question, did they do it? Did they practice it? We know by the time, this is, centuries before the exile of Israel. We know by the time of the exile, by the time the Israelites were taken out of their homeland to Babylon as exiles, we know that wasn't happening because they were in exile then. And then some of them returned back to their homeland after the exile, but at that point, foreigners were ruling over them. The foreigners weren't encouraging them to do Jubilee. We know at that point, Jubilee was not being observed, like the time of the prophets. Jubilee was not being observed. But something really interesting happened. During this time when Jubilee wasn't being observed and the prophets were writing and praying and speaking, the prophets began picking up on Jubilee as almost this powerful, mythical vision. Because imagine you're a prophet, you're speaking to the people of Israel, and there's this sense among the people, we've lost our home, we've been sent into exile. and we just want to come home. Or maybe we're back in our homeland, but we're not on our ancestral land, and foreigners are ruling over us, and most of our taxes are going to foreigners. And imagine you're a prophet, and you want to talk to the people about a time when God is going to make things right. When you want to talk to the people about a time when the people are going to come home and we're going to be forgiven and we're not going to live in this kind of cycle of poverty anymore. And God has promised to set up this new kingdom of God, of justice and generosity. What word might you use? What image might you pull on to describe what this is going to feel like? Jubilee. To proclaim, to roar. And so like Isaiah the prophet, chapter 61, he's talking about this time when God will act to bring restoration. And Isaiah says that a spirit-anointed leader will come. And this leader will proclaim to roar throughout the land and the year of the Lord's favor. What's the year of roar? That's Jubilee. And in the first century, in ancient Israel, there's a young rabbi who went to the sleepy town of Nazareth on a Saturday morning. In the book of Luke, this ancient biography of Jesus, we read about this. Luke chapter 4:16, it says, Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. These people, they've held on to this hope for century after century. Jubilee has become this image of what God can do for his people. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And unrolling it, he found the place where it is written. And this is what Jesus read. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom, to proclaim to roar for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus shows up. We've talked about Luke 4 before, that this is his mission statement. This is what he is about. And Jesus says, "I am the long-awaited Spirit-anointed leader who comes to proclaim, to roar throughout the land. Liberty, freedom, homecoming." And Jesus, he's not literally saying, he's not literally saying, "I've come to set up this 50-year, reinstitute the 50-year economic policy." He's saying the values of Jubilee, what God was intending to do through Jubilee, that is what my movement, my kingdom is about. Return home and freedom. This is true spiritually. That through Jesus' movement is about people being invited home to God. People spiritually being set free from all the things that enslave them. And it's true physically and materially. That in the Jesus movement, there's a kind of radical generosity, a kind of debt forgiveness that should show up in ways like literal slaves being set free. Like generational poverty being broken, people literally being placed into homes. Jesus says, "This is what my movement is about." And anytime the Jesus movement has said that it's only about the spiritual things, or it's only about the physical material things, that it starts to go wrong. Because Jesus says, "I am king of all of it, and I have come to rescue all of it." And my movement is a Jubilee movement. And it's about people being invited home in every sense and being set free in every way possible. That the Jesus movement should feel like Jubilee. That when you're around communities, that their hearts have been captured by Jesus. That when their lives are being shaped by Jesus, it just feels like Jubilee. It just feels like Jubilee is breaking out. This is what you see around you. In ancient Israel, I mean, it's just so, what a beautiful, in ancient Israel, how perfect is this? In ancient Israel, there's the Day of Atonement, when the goat takes the sin away, the people know they're right with God, and then the shofar is blown, and then Jubilee is proclaimed, return home, and liberty is proclaimed. I mean, Jesus, it just points ahead to Jesus. Jesus he's the ultimate Day of Atonement. He is the one who takes the sin and the guilt and the moral wrongdoing of the world upon himself, and he takes it to the grave so it is done away with, and then he makes the announcement. He blows the shofar and says, guess what? My movement come, and everybody now is invited home. And release from captivity is going to happen wherever my movement lands. Doror, Jubilee. And it's not, Jesus doesn't do this as like, hey, this is an assignment, you need to feel guilty and get it done. Like Jesus says, welcome to the party. I've done it for you. Jesus says, I want to invite people home. And what I did, Jesus, I want to invite people into freedom. And the Son of God took on imprisonment. The Son of God literally had handcuffs on that we could be set free in all the deepest ways possible. He says, I want to invite you home. I don't want to invite you out of every exile you've experienced. And so the Son of God literally went into the exile of the tomb that we could experience homecoming in the deepest ways possible. He takes our place, the ultimate Day of Atonement, so that he could proclaim Doror, Jubilee, homecoming, freedom. The Jesus movement.
Thanks for listening. For more info, visit hcbellingham.com and join us any Sunday, 9 and 11 a.m.